There we go. So, to start off our interview, my name is Scott Hansen, and I am a writer for a research project I'm doing. I've contacted Guy Windsor, who is an expert on swords, and he has read through a selection of my work and given me some good feedback on the notes about that. I mentioned that while he may not have written the book on swords, he has translated them. There's multiple books of them. And so I've reached out to him, and he was generously and graciously agreed to do an interview here. Guy, would you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Hi, I'm Guy Windsor, and I research medieval and Renaissance Italian sword fighting. I find treatises written on the subject by people who actually knew what they were doing, and then I try and emulate what those treatises recommend. So when I'm teaching, for example, late 14th century Italian longsword fighting, it's all coming from my research on that particular source. So my technical job title is consulting swordsman. So I go around helping people fix their sword problems. Of course, with the coronavirus, I don't tend to go around that much. These days, I tend to do it mostly over the internet, but that seems to work too. So there you go.
Nice. Did you choose the title of consulting swordsman in reference to Sherlock Holmes as a consulting?
I absolutely did. Yes, yes. I actually wrote a blog post about it when I made the change, because basically I was teaching swordsmanship full time in my school in Helsinki, and we wanted to move to the UK because my wife wanted to move to the UK, and a sensible husband does what his wife wants. So,
right.
So I sort of figured out how to make a living through swordsmanship without actually showing up to teach night after night. And when that was sorted out, we moved over, and I thought, you know, if Moriarty can be a consulting villain and Sherlock Holmes can be a consulting detective, I can jolly gosh darn well be a consulting swordsman, and so that's what I am. So I'm not technically in charge of a school anymore.
Nice.
But what I do is when a school or a club or a person has a sword problem or wants my insight on whatever they're working on, then they hire me to go and teach them. So in actual practice, it's not much different to what I used to do, but in terms of how I relate to my job, it's quite a big difference.
Cool. When did you first realize that you wanted to devote so much attention to swords?
That's kind of a tough one, because for a long time I was, I did swords as a hobby. I was madly interested. I chose to spend much of my free time hanging out with friends and whacking them over the head with swords, or getting whacked over the head with swords more often. And we got into the research. We started figuring out how it was done historically. That all became super interesting. But my day job was being a cabinet maker. And it's kind of a long story, and I'm not nearly drunk enough to tell the really interesting bits of it, so I'll skip to the chase. Basically, in 2000, I decided to switch from being a cabinet maker who does swords occasionally to becoming a full-time teacher of swordsmanship. And moved to Helsinki and opened a school, and I've been doing that ever since. I was in 2001 we opened the school.
And kind of a gradual expanse of this interest.
No, it was literally, actually, I was like deeply confused and lost and generally like at a crossroads, and so I thought, you know what, I'm a martial artist, so I'll do what martial artists apparently do in this situation. And I got in a car with a friend, and we drove up to the Highlands. I was living in Edinburgh at the time, and I literally walked up a hill, and I sat on the top of it, and I meditated until the way became clear. And it became clear extremely quickly when a voice in my head said, go to Helsinki and open a school of swordsmanship. So I did. It was literally that straightforward. That's
amazing.
Yeah, well, I mean, apparently in martial arts circles that's actually kind of common, but yes. yeah, it was just, so it wasn't even really a decision.
Huh. That's very cool. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that at all.
No problem. It's not what most people expect, because I'm sort of known for being like, when teaching, I'm very organized and rational, and I can support everything with reasoned argument and blah 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 blah. But actually, that's not how I live at all. I live entirely on instinct and, you know, revelation. So,
very cool. That's awesome. When people find out that you're a sword enthusiast, what are some of the first questions that they usually ask?
it's always, so you teach actors then? And I'm like, well, I mean, I know some actors who happen to be good martial artists and I teach them, but so the answer that I give them, which is, I assume what you're actually interested in, is okay, on stage, everybody should see what's happening and nobody dies. In an actual sword fight, nobody should see what just happened and somebody dies. So while there's an enormous overlapping skill set, like control of weapons, control of distance, all that sort of thing, the actual fundamental goal of the art is diametrically opposed between stage combat and the martial arts of medieval and Renaissance Europe. Okay, now that's a bit of an overstatement, because of course in Renaissance and medieval Europe there were also martial displays, and you know, the joust. What is the joust if not a fantastically dangerous martial display, which has an awful lot of theatre and drama and stuff in it? And of course, if you're doing some sort of, you know, public duel, how you win is as important as if you win, almost, because it's all about social status and reputation and all that sort of thing, right?
Interesting.
Whereas, so it's an overstatement to say, you know, on stage everyone sees it and nobody dies, and what I'm interested in is nobody sees it and somebody dies. But as a martial artist, my real interest is in mortal combat done with sidearms. Okay, so it's a weapon you have on you, and not some special big thing you have to carry about or have somebody carry about for you, but the stuff you actually wear as part of your clothing. So like when it comes to shooting, I shoot pistols. I'm not really interested in rifles. I can shoot a rifle, but it's not my thing. Pistols, absolutely. When it comes to swords, if you can hang it on your hip, that's my jam. If it's a sword that was never worn, like for example, épée de combat, I'm familiar with it. I quite like fencing it, but I'm not fundamentally interested in it because it's a weapon that was only ever brought out of its box for the duel, right? It was never worn. Likewise, I'm familiar with the schiavone, spadone, the two-handed Italian sword of the 16th century. It's not really my thing because you kind of have to, either you have to have a servant carrying it for you, and I don't have any servants, you know, 21st century, what can I say? Or you have to be deliberately on your way to training or on your way to battle or on your way to a duel, right? Whereas the spada da filo, the kind of the sword that they were just carrying with them everywhere they went, that's more interesting to me because it's what you carry. So, and I'm not hugely interested in displays. I'm much more interested in the mental headspace you have to be in to deliberately and without hesitation take somebody's life. Not something I've ever done or want to do, but I find that a very interesting headspace. So so when they say, you know, oh, so you teach actors then, I'm like, no, it's more like a judo class actually.
Nice.
Or if I don't want the conversation, and they say, oh, what do you do for a living? I say, oh, I'm a writer. And they say, oh, well, I've read any of your books. I say, oh, probably not. It's just like non-fiction stuff is very boring.
the right answer for the right person.
Right, exactly. And some people, you say swords and their eyes kind of light up and go, oh, swords, oh, cool, tell me more. And yeah, I'll have a conversation with them all night, no problem. Others are like, swords? Okay. You don't get it? I'm not going to explain it to you. I'll give you the polite answer. I'm happy to chat to you about something else. Cheese, wine, books, stationery, fountain pens. I have lots of interests. But there's no point trying to explain to somebody why swords are cool. They either get it or they don't. And if they don't get it, there's nothing I can do for them.
So how much overlap would you say there is between the swordsmanship classes that you do and martial arts like judo or mixed martial arts or things like that?
Okay, interesting question. There's a lot of technical overlap. So, for example, a lot of the throws you see in judo, you also see in Fiore de Liberi's Il Fiore Battaglia, right? They have some similar throws. But the thing is, in judo, it only counts if you pin the person on their back, because that makes for a better fight. In any kind of mortal combat, if you throw somebody down, you want them on their front, because then they can't use their arms and legs, right? Police officers don't arrest people by putting them on their backs. They put them on their fronts and put their hands behind their back, and that's, because then they're helpless or pretty helpless, okay? So in any kind of combat, the rules make the game. So, we have some kicks and some punches, but someone with a bit of, I don't know, medieval combat background is going to get slaughtered in an MMA ring where all they do is kicks, punches, wrestles, and grappling stuff, right? Because the rules are different. But if you, I don't know, throw a knife in the ring, maybe that changes. Or if you both show up with swords, maybe that changes, right? So what is considered the what is considered the game, what is considered the fight, changes from domain to domain. So a boxer has a totally different sort of regime and a way of fighting than a wrestler. And MMA has boxing and wrestling and kickboxing, so they have a nice complete package, but they don't do weapons. We tend to focus on the weapons, which changes everything. And we have a lot in common, I found, with traditional Japanese weapons arts, traditional Chinese weapons arts. When the weapon comes out, it simplifies everything because there's only really one thing you can worry about. And you know how, like, for example, a boxer is trained to take a hit. So in a boxing match, if you get like punched once and that's it, you're done, you're a really bad boxer. Okay. But if that punch has like 18 inches of blade attached to it, right, you cannot afford to get hit even once. Yeah. So it changes everything. So I find a lot of common ground with traditional arts that tend to come from a more, shall we say, military background, or traditional arts that come from a more weapons-based background than I do with, for instance, judo. But having a background in judo is a great preparation for doing medieval martial arts because there's lots of wrestling in it. And if you know how to throw somebody, you can pretty much choose to throw them on their front or their back. In judo, you'll remember, oh, stick them on their back because then I win. And if you're trying to kill them or trying to, I didn't say kill them. We don't kill people. That'd be very wrong. We have throws that dislocate arms and throw them on the back of their neck or whatever, which we can't practice it to conclusion because then we'd have dead students. But if you have a judo background, you'll find learning that stuff quite easy because all the mechanics are familiar. They're just applied slightly differently. Likewise, if you are, trained in, I don't know, one of the Japanese sword arts, you'll find all sorts of commonalities with European sword arts because, a 3 or 4 foot long piece of steel, there's only a certain number of ways that you can use it intelligently.
you're not talking about kendo per se.
Well, kendo isn't steel. Kendo is
Right.
has
Right.
a shinai made of split bamboo that is designed to, and it has a very, very restricted rule set. Okay.
Right.
Only specific actions count. And it's like every other art. It has its particular restricted area, right? And within that area, it does what it does very well, but it doesn't necessarily track outside that area. But yes, I've had kendo students who have been quite surprised at the way we behave with swords sometimes, because it's totally different to how things are done in kendo. But we have to remember that so much of any martial art is all about cultural convention. Yes, so martial arts are cultural. So for instance, just to take one example, we don't see much in the way of quick draw sword techniques in European sources, because generally speaking, the duel was prearranged and you came to the duel with the sword drawn, or you drew the sword out of measure and approached, or you were handed the sword and then you approached. Whereas in Japanese swordsmanship, there is a lot of quick draw stuff, because the duel would normally start with the sword in the sheath and therefore or in the scabbard. And so the draw was part of it, and the quicker you were, the more likely you were to survive in some cases. So you have a kind of quick draw culture there, but that's entirely cultural. I mean, likewise, in the middle of or towards the end of the 17th century, the sword went from being 4 feet long and quite heavy and very good at shoving all the way through a skull, a rapier. And as far as I'm aware, just for the sake of fashion, I think the King of France, Louis XIV at the time, just decided he was fed up with everybody tripping over these great long swords, and so he had small swords made. And so everybody switched to the small sword because it was fashionable, right? It's a very good weapon. It's perfectly good at killing people, but it's less than 3 feet long. So, if you have a fair duel starting from out of measure with a chap with a rapier and a chap with a small sword, the chap with the rapier has the advantage. Simply because the rapier is better adapted. There are more ways to kill somebody with a rapier than there are with a small sword, and you can do it from further away. Okay. But you wouldn't show up to court wearing a rapier in 1700. I mean, people would just laugh you out of the place. It'd be like showing up to court now wearing, like late 18th century wig. I mean, they would just laugh at you. You wouldn't do it, right? Fashion changes everything. The duel stopped being done in Europe because it became unfashionable, right? It had been illegal for centuries, most of the time in most places, but people kept doing it because it was winked at. Gentlemen could get away with it. And yet, it just stopped being, social suicide to decline. Okay. And that's what makes the difference, because a vast amount of martial arts is culturally determined.
Interesting. That's cool. Thank you.
Yeah. I think I got a little bit off topic there, but
no worries. I decided ahead of time to call my nerves. I just need to be focused on learning, and whatever you have to share is wonderful. Question: what has been the most rewarding part of your study?
What has been the most rewarding part? Sorry, the audio is not so good. Is that what has been the most rewarding part of my study?
Of your study, yeah.
Oh, if you said of my job, it would be how some students have kind of just blossomed when exposed to the sword, right? It's like putting water on a seed. It's amazing. That's the best bit of my job, no question. Best bit of my study, Ooh, that's a hard question, because at the time when you're studying, it's actually often really tedious and really hard work. And it's like, digging through medieval manuscripts is, yeah, it's a certain kind of fun, but it's not, it's not happy fun. It's hard fun. So I think probably the best thing about it for me is that we can test our theories sword in hand, which is something that most academics don't get to do. Yeah, scientists can do it. They have come up with a theory. They go, oh, this should work. They run an experiment to test the theory. Hypothesis becomes experiment. Experiment produces data. Data supports or does not support the hypothesis, right? So they have that process. In most sort of literary work,
Right.
there isn't that sort of real world bullshit detector. But for us, we have that. So let's say I come up with some grand new theory for how to do Fiore's Scambiare di Punta, exchange of thrust. So I get one of my students and I say, okay, try and stab me in the face and I'll try and do this thing. And if I walk my face onto their point, obviously when we're testing these things, we're wearing masks and things, so that I can walk my face onto their point if I'm wrong. When I'm wrong a lot. We have that sort of real world kind of sword meets mask. Oh crap, maybe my theory isn't quite right. So then you have to go, well, is it that my idea is good but the execution is wrong, or is the idea wrong regardless of the execution? And then you can sort of play with different types of execution or whatever, and eventually you decide that this theory of what this particular bit of the book means, what it represents, you can come up with a supportable position on what it means. Whereas you can't do that when you're, I don't know, criticizing Hamlet, for instance. You just have an opinion and you can support it with the text or not. But that's it.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, maybe you put it on as a play and people like it or not, but how much of that is the director? How much is the audience? How much is the stage and the actors and all that sort of stuff? As you may be able to tell, my educational background is in English lit.
A sword, I wrote a word here, I'm not sure I can pronounce, a sword aficionado.
Okay, well, the worst part of being a sword aficionado is swords are expensive. And I mean, that's just unfortunate. The worst part of being a swordsmanship professional is it's really difficult to make a decent living swinging swords around. Okay, so if by your question you mean what's the worst part of the hobby of swordsmanship, I would say probably the risk of injury and the expense.
That's probably a better question.
If you mean what the worst part of the job is, it's all the stuff you have to do to actually make it pay the bills.
A lot of infrastructure and hustling behind the scenes.
Yes. I mean, and some of that's a good thing, because if I didn't need to sell books to make a living, I probably wouldn't write so many of them. And the tiny proportion of the human population that are into my thing like my books, so that's keeping them happy, which is a good thing. And I'm fundamentally lazy, so if there wasn't a certain financial pressure, I would probably write fewer books and produce fewer courses and what have you. But yeah, so yeah, the hardest part of the job is it's a job. And basically finding ways of actually making a living at it has been tricky.
Okay. If a percentage, how would you divide how much you've learned from texts from how much you learned from practice?
Okay. If I'm doing my job right, if you see me fence or any of my students fence, you can see which book they're working from and which bits of the book you may have a different interpretation of. Like, for example, I have a friend who's a rapier instructor, and I saw some of his students fence, and I went over to him and I say, okay, we need to talk about plate 5 in Capoferro, because clearly you're interpreting figure L differently to the way I am, right? Which is a huge compliment to his students and to his instruction, because it was obvious that they're doing Capoferro rapier. And they were so clear in their execution of what they were doing, I could tell where I would teach them to do it differently, right?
Wow.
So, so the book to me is primary, and in any like beginner's class, for instance, or in any class that I teach, the primary source that we are working on, I don't know, Fiore's or Fiore Battaglia, or Capoferro's Gran Simulacro, or Angelo's School of Fencing, or 133, whichever one, it's there. And in my cell, it's on a lectern, open, and any student can and should go and check it. And at any point, it should be clear to everybody whether we are doing something exactly by the book, taking a technique or theory or action from the book, and then playing with its, playing with what it is and how it works in slightly different contexts. So making it kind of more of a skill and less of a piece of the knowledge. Or whether we have, for whatever reason, we're doing something that's not in the book at all, like, for example, push-ups, right? So it should be really clear in any of my classes how what we're doing relates to our source. So for me, you can't really separate the practice from the book, but most of what I've learned about how to teach, how to train, how to get a whole bunch of students to safely swing lethal weapons around and get better at doing it without killing anybody, all of that stuff, I didn't learn from some historical source. I learned that from more modern books, or from training courses, or from experience in the real world. So to my mind, there's a fundamental distinction to make between what we're training and how we're training it.
Interesting.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah. It kind of sheds a little bit of light onto kind of how a better question would be something else, which I think is a great part of the conversation. So thank you for that. Yeah. The next question I've got is a little bit more about my amateur background with swords. I've messed around with what we call here boffer swords, padded PVC pipes, things like that, and I've done some fencing. But I'm very curious to know what's something that a person only comes to know about swordsmanship after long-term practice and repetition and exposure.
Okay, the answer that pops into my head is what it feels like when your opponent is holding something sharp. Okay. And of course, most people doing historical swordsmanship don't experience that, because most people don't use sharps. I do, many of my colleagues do, and all of my senior students who want to do, but not all of them want to. Critical distinction. But I would say the key difference is when your opponent is, or when your partner is holding a sharp sword, you know that even if they don't want to hurt you with it, if you make a mistake, it's going to hurt, and it might even kill you, right? You just don't get that with a buffer, and you don't get that with sport fencing. Yes, accidents can happen and blades can break and go through, and you can get your cornea scratched with a buffer if you were unlucky, and or you could be playing with your friends and trip over and break your leg, right? But that's not the same as that thing that they're holding. If either one of us makes a mistake, that's going through my face.
Is designed to.
Yes, it's exactly. It's like the difference between paintball and shooting, actual guns.
Yeah.
And of course, as with anything dangerous, familiarity breeds contempt, and you see experienced people on shooting ranges doing stupid things, and experienced people getting killed with guns because they have forgotten how bloody dangerous they are, because familiarity breeds contempt. We haven't got to that stage yet with swords, thankfully. I hope we never do. I know I don't use sharp swords all the time. Certainly not all the time, because many of my students aren't ready for it, but also I wouldn't choose to, because there should be something a little bit sort of, something to keep it, I guess, to make me mindful that the weapon is sharp. You should never get complacent with it. I mean, the internet is completely filled with videos of people doing gun safety demonstrations and having a negligent discharge, right? And the internet is also full of people pissing about with sharp blades and hurting themselves or other people, right? Because, if you've done it a few times, you forget that, and it hasn't hurt you, you forget that it's dangerous, right? People drive cars really quickly, and then they have a telephone conversation in the middle of driving a car really quickly when other people are driving cars quickly, and because you're used to it, it doesn't seem dangerous, and then people get killed, right? If every car had a foot-long, shiny, sharp steel spike sticking out at the driver through the steering wheel like this, right? There would be no car crashes, and no one would ever go above 10 miles an hour, right? Yeah. So I strongly believe in keeping the risk very visible, very apparent, because I think one of the things we're trying to sort of hone in on is what it was like to actually be in a duel. And one of the critical things that it was like to actually be in a duel was your opponent's weapon could go through you, right? And so we have lots of ways of approaching that, but I think that's when you ask the question, that's, I think, the thing that, sport fencing and boffer fighting and what have you just doesn't approach. Not that it should. That's not a criticism of either of those things. It's just, this is something that we do that they don't, and an experience that, well, the students of mine who've had that experience have all said it changes things. Like, oh, so that's why we do this. Oh, so that's why we don't ever do that. Because a risk that you'll take when your opponent's weapon is blunt is totally different to a risk that you'll take when it's sharp. As long as you remember it's sharp.
Interesting. So kind of a little bit more of what you mentioned about the headspace of somebody who's involved in a dual situation, the respect for what they're doing. Right.
And sure. And people are different, and I'm not suggesting that, every duelist went into a duel with some sort of respect for the blade, right? And of course, there are crazy people out there, always have been, always will be, right? But it's just one aspect of swordsmanship that I don't think you can get at if you're just training with boffers or just doing sport fencing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Kind of along those lines, when you meet people, do you ever notice things about them, like how they would be as an opponent in a duel? Like, do you notice reach or posture or length of their stride, things like that?
Yes, posture, way of moving, how they stand, how they sit, how they get up from sitting, how they move. It's just automatic. But also, I teach people, right? My primary thing is I teach people to do this, which means I look carefully at how people move, and I figure out how they can move better. So I'm always looking for where it's sticky, where it's not quite set up correctly, where that movement could be more fluid, right? More fluent, more connected to the ground. So yeah, it's kind of, if you take up dressmaking, right? everywhere you look, there are people wearing clothes and they're all stitched together, and you'll start noticing seams and how they work, and all that clothing doesn't fit properly, all that fits nicely, whatever. I've never done dressmaking, but I have friends who do, and they tell me this is true. Same is true for me. It's like, I sort of have to deliberately shut it off. Like, no, stop doing that. They're not your student. Leave them alone. But also, you know, I'm looking for weapons, their capacity to. Some people have an innate capacity for violence, which is, it's something you should be aware of when you interact with them. And you know, other things like, okay, I generally sit with my back to the wall if I can, because I just feel more comfortable when nobody can come up from behind, right? It's just, I don't know. I think most martial artists are like that. But I have several friends who, if we're eating in a restaurant, I want them sitting with their back to the wall, because I know that they are much more paranoid than me. And so they have, you know, they are much better equipped to handle some random violent event that might occur behind me in a restaurant, right? So I want them sitting where they can see, and I'm quite happy to sit facing them.
Interesting.
Right? I feel more comfortable sitting facing them than I would the other way around. Yeah. There's maybe 5 people who I'm friends with for whom that is true. Yeah. So, okay, we live in a very peaceful society. Despite what the news will tell you, like, violent crime is very rare and murder is very rare, and you know, all these things are very rare. So I don't go around worried that someone's going to jump out at me with a knife or something. It just doesn't, you know.
Yeah.
But I spend so much of my time thinking about how to win sword fights, how to handle a weapon, how to deal with someone else who's handling a weapon, how to judge an opponent, how to teach somebody else to judge an opponent, all that sort of stuff. I mean, it's my day job. So I will tend to, I try not to react to things too much, but I tend to notice whether somebody has a knife in their pocket or is moving in a way that makes it perfectly clear that they, you know, if they hit you, that's coming up from the ground. That's not just them swinging their arm around, right? And not out of, you know, if I see somebody who has a weapon and clearly knows what they're doing and is, you know, I'm not, that doesn't worry me. I'm not, it's not like, oh my God, that's a scary person, unless they also seem to be a bit nuts, in which case, yes, stay the hell away. But, you know, sometimes that's reassuring, right? Going through Heathrow Airport or wandering around in America where the cops all have guns, some of those officers make you feel super secure, and some really don't, right? And I'm willing to bet that my instinct as to which ones I should feel secure around is probably fairly good. Because it's how they move, how they look, what they're looking for, what they're looking at, how they're responding to what they're looking at. You know, the human subconscious mind has been analyzing threat for 1 million years, and it's really good at it. So it's just, you know, so when I get that sort of feeling, I can usually, because of what I do for a living, I can usually figure out why I got that feeling. But I trust that feeling whether I understand it or not.
Interesting. To get a little more specific on that point, is there has there ever been a person that you've met and said, I would not want to fence them? And
Jesus,
you articulate what you noticed?
So many, yeah. Okay, the people I don't want to fence. Firstly, they're the ones who are insecure, have an axe to grind. They want to basically win hard, win fast, score points, because their ego is
No.
fragile, and they need to protect it, right? I just stay away from them. I do get funny. I've had quite a lot of military veterans in my various classes, and universally they make excellent students because they follow orders, they stick to the safety protocols, they are safe around weapons because they know to respect them, they don't fuck about, and you know, they generally speaking, they're a delight to have in class. Every now and then you get someone who starts talking about their actual combat experience in class, and you know it's horseshit. and you know, I've had, like, I was teaching a class in America a little while ago, a couple of years ago, and I had a guy like that in the class, and he said, no, who's going to step out because, you know, it's all too real, and you know, it's a weapon, and you know, I can't turn it off once I turn it on, and right? But I also had a guy in that class who was a former US Marine sergeant, and he came up to me afterwards and said, that guy's full of shit. And I went, I know, he's totally full of shit. Because, you know, because this guy had, you know, this sergeant had served in, I believe it was Afghanistan and Iraq, and, you know, had been places and done things I will never go and never do and don't want to. And that's just not how people who've actually been there behave. Right? So yeah, basically people who are what's the best way to put it? Who are presenting a story about themselves that they cannot support.
Interesting.
Right? That's the thing. It's when you get someone who's, you know, we all tell stories about ourselves and each other, and we have a story about ourselves running in our head all the time. Well, that's normal. But you can come across people, particularly perhaps in martial arts, for whom their performance in your class is deeply connected to the story they're running in their head. And it's just, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work as a, like, okay, I went on a knife forging course a few months ago. A chap who lives near Ipswich called Sergio Muelle. I'm probably massacring pronunciation of his name, but really good smith, really nice guy. I had a brilliant time forging these marking knives. And he told me about someone who, one of his courses, who expected there to be loud, heavy metal music and to be hammering red hot metal in time to the music while he was forging for the first time. Right? Like, okay, not a serious student of blacksmithing at all. Someone who has this fantasy running in their head. And as far as he was concerned, Sergio's job was to make that fantasy happen. Okay? When I have somebody like that in front of me, I don't want to fence them, because I don't know exactly what role in their fantasy I'm playing, and so I don't know. Right? And so I don't know what rules they are actually following. Right? It's the rules that keep us safe to train. We're doing something dangerous. It's the rules that keep everybody safe. Okay? And you know, you can sneak up on anybody and cripple them if you just get the right situation at the right time. Right? And you can start out having a nice friendly fencing match with someone. And I've been in this situation and it really was not pleasant, where you think you're having a friendly fencing match, bish bash, bosh, tip tap tip. And when that is not the fantasy that's running in their head, and they suddenly go nuts on you and they try to actually hurt you with a 4-foot long piece of steel. That's when, firstly, you find out whether your training's any good or not. And secondly, you know you made a fundamental mistake, an error of judgment in kitting up and fencing that person. You should have spotted it before that happened and stayed the hell away, because it's dangerous, right? And, you know, so I'm careful who I fence.
It's great. It's insightful. So thank you.
My pleasure.
The next question I've got written down is, how would you, I know this will expand also to a lengthy discussion, so how would you briefly characterize the evolution of swords?
Well, I wouldn't, because I think evolution is entirely the wrong term. Because by and large, swords have not evolved. They have changed with changes in technology and changed with changes in culture. But if you look at, for example, 18th century smallsword and a 15th century longsword, one of them is fundamentally more efficient at killing lots of people, particularly if they're wearing armor, than the other. But one is an appropriate fashion statement for the 18th century, and one is an appropriate fashion statement for the 15th century. Okay, so to suggest that, for example, the rapier evolved out of the longsword, it's kind of sort of true-ish in that the rapier developed from the longsword, and you can see how, firstly, the longsword developed they kept the long blade, but then they added bits of complexity to the hilt, and then the hilt became a one-handed sword with the complexity added to it, and then it became spada da filo, which is like a mid-16th century or early to mid-16th century Italian sword. And then they added more protection to the hand and made the blade longer and thinner, and it became a rapier. But that isn't a process of evolution in the sense as it is generally meant, in the sense of getting better over time. Okay,
right.
Which is not actually what it technically means at all, but that's how people tend to understand it. So I would say that swords change primarily for cultural reasons, secondarily for technical ones. Like, for instance, the introduction or the development of the ability to produce steel cheaply massively changed how swords were produced. And you started getting blades mass produced in factories, which are literally kind of rolling them out already by the, I think, late 17th, early 18th century. I'm a little bit vague on my metallurgy, I'm afraid. The person whose work you should look into on this is Alan Williams, who's like the archaeometallurgist of weapons. I mean, he pretty much invented the field. And he's done fantastic studies of the types of steel used and how it was produced and all that kind of stuff. But basically, in the 15th century, the peasant armies, the peasants weren't carrying swords. They were carrying basically modified agricultural implements and spears. Okay. Yes, they had some sword-like objects, like a kind of machete type thing, which we tend to call we can call it a falchion, or we can call it a mesa or a storta or whatever. But they tend to be carrying something that's not out of place, hacking through an overgrown bit of an orchard, right? Whereas the gentlemanly classes, the rich people, are wearing armor and have swords which are just purely swords. Okay, they have no use other than for hitting people. So you've got this sort of, as the weapons technology got faster and cheaper, like by Napoleonic times, all cavalry troopers had swords issued to them, and they were a standard pattern. That did not happen 100 years earlier. Yeah.
Mm.
So that by itself, the ability to mass produce swords, put a sort of a pressure on the design of the swords to be mass producible, for instance. Okay. Yeah. Whereas before, you know, you had your munitions grade weapons, which were mass produced, but mass produced one at a time by smiths. You know, one guy banging out the same crossguard, you know, however many times a day, and somebody else banging out the same sorts of blades, and then somebody else putting the crossguards and the blades together, and somebody else putting the handle on. They had sort of production lines in a sense, but they were still producing things mostly by hand. When that became sort of more industrialized, we have a massive change in the way swords are designed and how they're produced. So yeah, it's not really my area, because I just tend to go, well, okay, I found this fantastic book and it's full of people fighting with swords and it's from this period. So the sort of swords they're using is probably this kind of sword, and right, that's the kind of sword I want. I don't really care so much how it's made, which is odd because in other areas, you know, I actually make stuff. You know, I build stuff out of wood and I, you know, bind my own books and what have you. So, but when it comes to swords, I'm just like, I don't actually really care how it's made. I just, does it handle correctly? Does it feel right? Does it fit this style that I'm studying from this source? But I would get away from the evolutionary notion. I'm not sure that was a good answer to your question.
No, very, very helpful. Yeah, that's good. It kind of plays into some of the next questions that I've got jotted down, and maybe I could rattle them off a couple at a time, and you could answer them however you see fit.
I can just sort of juggle them. And...
Yeah. So, paired question: if you had to pick one sword from your current collection to keep, which would it be? And pick any sword in the world to add to your collection, which would it be? Okay.
I know which sword I would keep. That's easy. In September last year at the Sword Squatch event, the organizers of the event, and it's in Seattle, and it's run by members of a club that I've been involved with for over a decade now. They kind of set me up because 6 months previously, when I was there teaching a seminar, Angus Trim, who's a sword maker, very good sword maker, came and just showed me a bunch of his swords and just asked me which one I liked the best. And there was one that was really kind of, when I picked it up, I kind of got a little bit manic. So I said, well, you know, actually, Gus, if I was in the market for a sword, I don't have the money right now, but that's what I picked. I went, oh, okay, that's interesting. I thought you picked that one. No, that one. No, okay, fine. 6 months later in September, at the sort of the closing ceremonies of this event, they just present me with this sword as a kind of thank you for the work I've done with them over the last however long and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it was just one of those sort of moments, right? So that's the sword I would keep, right? As to if there's one sword in the world I could add to my collection, see, the thing is, I'm not actually a sword collector, right? I have lots of different swords because I need different swords for the different things I want to do with swords. Like I need rapiers for teaching rapier, and I need long swords for doing longsword, and right. And I like swords, and I will happily buy swords that I don't necessarily need terribly much. But I'm not actually a collector in the sense of, you know, I need this for my collection and that for my collection, right? So what I would do is I would find the most expensive sword in the world, and I would have that. And then I would immediately sell it. And with that money, which would be some millions and millions of dollars, I would end up with, you know, I would support a whole bunch of good, really good modern smiths to make me a whole bunch of really nice swords that I'd like to have. And I would be buying loads of historical fencing treatises in their original, you know, like an original edition. You know, I have a 1606 Fabris, and I have a Marozzo from 1568, and they're like, "Oh my god, that's so cool!" So I have a bunch more of them. And obviously, you know, I take my wife on holiday because, and the kids too.
The short answer though is that you'd meta the game.
Yes, exactly. Because I don't particularly want one like super pretty valuable sword that I would feel awkward picking up and swinging around. It would become like an anchor or a burden. Be pretty and beautiful and lovely, but I don't know, it would probably feel more like a shackle than a bracelet, if that makes sense.
You're more
So yeah,
interested in the
I'd buy the most expensive one, I'd flog it, and I use the money for all kinds of interesting things.
Cool. Next set, a kind of paired question also would be, what separates a quality sword from a bad one, and what separates a quality swordsperson from a bad one?
Okay. Okay, a quality sword is quite easy. It has to be built properly out of the proper materials. If you use poor quality steel, it's probably a bad sword. If you put it together badly, it's a bad sword. If it doesn't handle right for the weapon it's supposed to be, it's a bad sword. So there are lots of objective standards you can put on what makes a good sword, and you know, is it a good example of its type? Does it do the thing it's designed to do? You know, if I hit something with it, is it going to break? So, you know, with any of the decent modern makers, you don't have to worry about build quality. So then it's just about, how does it feel when you pick it up? Is it, you know, if you need a long sword, there's no point buying a rapier. But if you need if you pick up the long sword and this one feels a little clunky, this one feels a bit too light, this one feels, this one, oh, hello, then that's the one you should get. So once the objective standards are met, you know, is it the right type? Is it built properly? That sort of thing. Then it's really about what makes you grin, and that's entirely subjective. As to what makes a good swords person, that's a really tricky question, because it kind of depends on, again, by what criteria. So, you know, there are some fantastic athletes at the moment who are doing like sport longsword stuff. I'm sure they'd hammer me in a fencing match. So they're obviously in that area good at swords. But there are also people who, you know, because they're, I don't know, older or have various disabilities or diseases or whatever, will never get to anything like that physical standard, but who, to my mind, are even better examples of the essence of what it is to be a swords person. Here's a good example. I have a student called Anders who has a rare genetic condition, which is kind of a dwarfism, and it basically means none of his joints work properly, right? Wow. And he's like yay tall, and you know, so you'd say, you know, not who you think of when you think excellent sword person, right? But actually, just to give an idea of what he was like, in a lot of our training games, there are push-up penalties. And one time, he had injured his wrist, or his wrists weren't working properly because, you know, none of his joints work properly. And so he couldn't do push-ups. And for about a month, he couldn't do push-ups. When his wrists were working again, he had counted up all the push-ups that he'd missed in all of the games and stuff where he, you know, got a penalty and should have done push-ups. And he did, over the course of the next couple of weeks, the whole lot.
Holy smokes.
That is a sword person. Right. Right. That's the thing to me.
That's cool.
It's that I don't know, it's that recognition of the truth of it. that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if I could articulate it, but the story makes sense very much. So.
Yeah, yeah. That's the thing that I'm you know, that's the thing that to me makes the difference between the great students and the good or less good students. It has nothing to do with, you know, physical dexterity or ability to read 17 foreign languages, you know, or whatever, which is also, you know, a very handy skill to have. You know, a lot of these sources are not written in, you know, my native language. In fact, most of the sources I work with are not written in my native language. So, God damn, it would be really good to be a talented linguist, which I'm not. But, but yeah, at the end of the day, it's that. I don't know, putting the truth ahead of your comfort. That's the thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, and here's the thing: nobody would have thought less of him if he'd just not done the push-ups, right?
Internal
I mean,
drive.
why would they? You know, you have an injury, you don't do the exercise. It's like normal. It's just like we don't have any of that macho bullshit culture in my school where, I don't know, yes, you know, you're bleeding out your ears, but you still do 200 push-ups. No, bleeding out your ears, you
Cobra Kai.
Right, exactly. Yes, so, you know, no one would have thought anything of it if you just not done the push-ups. It'd be fine.
Yeah, that's cool. I thought that was a cool moment when I heard.
Yeah, I can't really articulate it any better than that. It's not a thing that has a name. It's an attitude and a state of mind.
Yeah. Back again to the headspace.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Guy. I appreciate your time and your willingness to share your experiences and the expertise that you develop, and your candid insights as well. This has been an excellent learning opportunity for me. And I think everybody else will get a lot out of this as well.
You're very welcome, Scott. It's been a pleasure.
And for anyone interested in learning more about what Guy has researched and translated and studied and done, he has a wealth of material available on his website, and we'll include the link for that below.